Yves Congar, the French Dominican theologian of the 20th century, once said that the Eucharist makes the Church and the Church makes the Eucharist. In a way, Congar was simply summing up a larger heritage of the early Church where they saw the Eucharist and the Church to be correlative terms, constitutive one of the other. Or St. Augustine is said to have preached to the early catechumens that we are to become that which we celebrate. And so we as a church are called to become Eucharist. Two questions that I would ask today is, how is the Eucharist constitutive of the church? And why is this gathering fundamental to who we are as a Eucharistic assembly? I propose to do this in two sessions, or two periods. In the first one, I'd like to ask the role of the assembly itself, focusing on how the assembly represents the church, or is the church. And in the second period, look more specifically at the role of the Eucharistic assembly. So what does the Eucharist, how does the Eucharist constitute us as a church? In this way, we can get to the fundamental question of today's session, called, what do we do when we gather for Eucharist? First of all, let's look at the word itself, assembly. This comes from the Greek Septuagint, the Greek word ekklesia, which is a translation of the Hebrew word kahal, which means a people, a gathering. But the insistence in the Old Testament and in the Greek New Testament is that this is a gathering of people called together or summoned by God. It places a heavy emphasis on the fact that it is God who takes the initiative. It is God who calls. We find this, for example, at the very beginning of Lent, in that first reading from Joel, where we hear these words, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, proclaim a fast, call an assembly, gather the people, notify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and the infants at the breast." This gathering then places an emphasis on the divine initiative as the one who calls us together to be a people, an assembly. The New Testament term, however, ecclesia, the word for church, really comes from secular usage. It was used to refer to a political city-state in Greece. But the New Testament draws upon that rich Old Testament understanding of a people called together to be God's people, to be the kahal Yahweh, but with some notable differences. We have another term in the Christian New Testament, the word synagoge, in the Greek, simply a translation of the Hebrew edah. But here the emphasis falls upon the institutional character of those who come together as this group, as a synagogue. Whereas the Christian community is distinguished somewhat from the kahal in that it is a little bit looser gathering. It's not so institutionalized. Originally, that term, ecclesia, refers to the local community in Jerusalem, the mother church, as it is referred to in the Acts of the Apostles. In the course of time, however, this is expanded to include all of the local communities, beginning in Jerusalem, but then moving throughout Antioch, throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, again as we find it in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 9. Ultimately, this ecclesia is the universal church spoken about in Acts 15. It is all of the faithful who believe in Jesus Christ.